this is exactly the academic hour, so we'll try to monitor the clock and the time in the interest of our conversation. Of course, my first responsibility as a moderator is to welcome all of you. Of course, the ambassador that whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, and Ambassador Charlie Ray, who is known to many of you because he's participating in our academic activity on the role of diplomacy to combat terrorism. At any rate, so first let me welcome all of you, and I would like to mention particularly a warm welcome to the diplomats from the embassy, many of whom I know who participated in our activities in the past, and some of our colleagues from other embassies, as well as students and academics and so forth. So we distributed the information, the bio of Ambassador Kmonicek, who is very, very distinguished, as you can see. What's really caught my eye, again, trying to follow what's happening in that particular region for a long time. He was appointed in 2013, his appointment here, but he served as director of the Foreign Affairs Department at the office of the President of the Czech Republic, and then a very distinguished diplomatic career for over 20 years, when he joined the Foreign Ministry, and particularly some of the departments such as the Middle East, North Africa, as well as Asia, America, and he also served as Deputy Foreign Minister, and he served as Ambassador to Australia, India, UN, and so forth. But to me, as a simple, academic, obviously I always look at that kind of background, and to me, immediately, it was evident in terms of very rich academic work at the Charles University in Arabic and Middle East Studies, and then again at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, also Arabic language, and so on. And I had the honor personally to be a visiting professor for lectures at Charles University in International Law and Relations, and it's a old relationship, which I would mention in a minute. But also at Hebrew University, I was a professor for some 25 years, not all the time, summers and semesters, and trying to shuttle between the United States and Israel at the time. So I think we have some common ground. So he will speak, obviously, soon. And then, as I mentioned, Ambassador Charlie Ray, right here, will join us, obviously, and he will make some comments or raise questions and so forth. Again, I want to mention something about his background. He's a retired Foreign Service officer. He served about 30 years in the State Department and also U.S. military, which included Vietnam, for example, and military intelligence, special operations, public affairs, and all that. And he served in Europe as well as in Asia, Korea, Vietnam, Panama, Latin America, and so on. So fortunately, we're trying to look at the role of diplomacy in combating terrorism. So basically, that's I think, the plan. And I have one or two footnotes because I think it's relevant, particularly for some of our graduate students here. We have about 4 graduate students from AU and so on because of Charles University and the relationship with them in terms of international law, in terms of international relations, and actually interdisciplinary. Just a little quick footnote. Since we are looking also at historical lessons, I want to mention as a footnote that during the Cold War, obviously, at that time Czechoslovakia was in the East Bloc, and as academics, we tried to stay away from fake news, but there was a great deal of psychological warfare and propaganda. And in fact, I have some information for you on one of the books that was published in Moscow by Professor Vilchenko on terrorism and international law. And I had the honor at the time to be at Georgetown at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, working with Dr. Ray Klein, who was during his service as deputy CIA. So immediately they put me under the CIA. If I were under the CIA, I would do quite well, I guess, financially, but I had nothing to do with the CIA, despite all the stories right there. So just to make sure that this is clear. But the good news about the Cold War, that although it was difficult to communicate, we had a second front line, so to speak, in Geneva at the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They had a center called Henri Dunant Institute dealing with humanitarian law, international law. And fortunately, the director for many years was a Czech scholar by the name of Dr. Jerry Toman. His father served actually as a assistant or a advisor to President Beneš at the time. But Jerry Toman couldn't get back to Prague, so he conducted his work through Geneva with the Red Cross, and he became a very accomplished scholar in humanitarian law and the laws of war and all that. So again, we tried to use that vehicle to find some ways, links with Prague and so forth. So again, this is just as background. And of course, as academics, we had a chance to participate in the so-called second track diplomacy during the Cold War. For example, to build bridges between Russia and Soviet Union at the time, the United States, Poland, and some other countries. I won't go into it, but the point is that academics, again, were observers, but sometimes also participants. Now, with that background, I would like to mention that usually we express condolences, sympathy at our meetings. Those who are victimized by Mother Nature, and as we discussed today, the situation, of course, I'm sure that all of you are aware that hundreds were killed and wounded in an earthquake in Iran and Iraq. So we want to express the sympathies to the victims from Mother Nature, and we like to express our condolences for those who were killed or maimed through terrorist activities. And finally, I think we have to acknowledge the contribution, the really extraordinary contributions, like many countries like the Czech Republic, to combat terrorism. And as an academic working with NATO, we are actually aware of the special contribution of the Czech Republic in this particular area. So with this short introduction, I welcome you to make any presentation. It would be followed by Q&A and discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Thanks for introduction, and especially thanks for everybody who decided to spend the time with Czechs, especially to the people who are not from my own embassy, because they have it compulsory. So anybody who is not from the Czech embassy is twice as welcomed as my own diplomats. But they know that I don't take it hard on them. My topic today is a Czech Republic-U.S. strategic partnership, and you would probably expect a classical ambassador speech, Cold War, communism, revolution, new democracy, and what to do with it, and everything is rosy. Nothing like that. It would be way too predictable and way too boring. So I decided to give you a little bit broader, more academic thinking about the Czech and US partnership and strategy, about why this strategy is working, why it is good for both of the sides, or what can be changed, and how it can or needn't be limited. Because when we talk about strategy is basically military term associated with the security. And your security is dictated by two factors: who you are and where you are. So let me start with a little bit of who the Czechs are and what it dictates to Czechs given the place where we Czechs are on the map. So first of all, every time you think about our role or the Central European role in the history, the look at the map gives you the first clue. The Czechs moved to the territory of the Central Europe, what we call today the Central Europe, somewhere between 6th to 9th century. Basically 1,100 years ago. And we moved to the territory where everybody around us was, in modern terms, German. If you look at my country on the map, it is like a small Slavic island surrounded by 2/3 of the borders by the German-speaking element and the culture. And this was the first thing which the Czechs, given the geopolitical place where they are, had to face through most of their history. If we go a little bit deeper, who are the Czechs? So theoretically, language taken, Czech people are people who classify themselves as a Western Slavic people. Now, if you are a Western Slavic, it doesn't make much sense, okay? If you are a Slavic, you are supposed to be in the East. If you are in the West, you're not supposed to be Slavic unless you emigrated to the West. But we are, for 1,100 years, Western Slavic nation, dancing the diplomatic dance which should secure for us that we will stay Western, but without ending up as being ethnically Germanized or simply ending up as another Bavarians. And we try for 1,100 years to stay culturally Slavic without ending up eaten by Russians. So West Slavic people are no German nor Russian, but they reside in the territory which is historically super sensitive. It's the territory which Timothy Snyder would call bloodlands, and it's the territory which gave the origin of 2 world wars only in the 20th century. So for the Czechs, it meant basically something for their identity. If we really simplify the history of Europe post 30 Years' War, it seems to be all the time the same story. One of the European nations claimed the leadership of Europe, and the only way how to prove you are the biggest country, the biggest boy on the block, is to go east. You must claim your part of the Russian wars, which usually means that you go through the Czech territory. From Napoleon to Hitler, the same story. Usually it ends up the same. You happily defeat Russia, and the Russian winter defeats you. And you go back. From the point of the Czech national identity, it means that it's very hard to say who is the Czech by his or her ethnicity. Because we are the children of all these armies who went west to east and then from east to west. As we joke, usually they had the first child on the way to Moscow and the second child on the way from Moscow. And we are the ethnical mix of all these children of all the invading armies who went through our territory. If you really go deeper into our history, I usually claim that we and the Zaire, former Zaire, are the only 2 countries who were ever really occupied by Belgian soldiers. We used to have the Belgian-Flemish occupation in the 17th century. Practically everybody in Europe occupied my country through last few hundred years, and practically everybody liked it. That's why he never destroyed it. It had its influence on the Czech ethnicity. It had the influence on our history because mentally taken, we take as a Czech anybody who speaks Czech. In that way, we are sometimes joking that we are more a language club than ethnically identifiable nation. If any one of you speaks Czech, he will be Czech for me, and for any other Czech you would meet. The result of it is that for Czechs, security was every time the first political preoccupation. Because if you want to stay who you are, Western Slavic, without ending up as German or ending up as Russian, and if you want to stay where you are on the map, simply one valley surrounded by the huge historic German influence, it is clear that you will have to have quite elaborated strategy to survive on your own in the place where you are based. This east-west dance basically starts for us somewhere around the year 950, where we already got the Christianity from the east, actually from Byzance. And we claimed our allegiance to the German bishop in Regensburg, in the west. And in that moment it was clear that we are not east, neither west. We are balancing somewhere in the middle. Over the years, we went through a complicated history of our own kingdom. Then we've been for 300 years part of Austrian Habsburg monarchy. I skipped that part quickly, not to take too much of your time. And in 1918, with the end of the First War, the concept of Czechoslovakia as a new country appeared from the ruins of Austrian Habsburg monarchy. Now, funny thing is that now we will celebrate 100 years of Czechoslovakia and the shaping role of our first president, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. But it was Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, as the founder of the state, who wrote in the year 1916, 2 years before he became a president of New Czechoslovakia, that he's totally against the concept of Czechoslovakia. I will quote, "I'm totally against the dissolution of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy, because the result would give us the situation where we could have just choose if we want to be influenced by German or Russian influence, and it would be the only choice we would have." And basically that's how he correctly predicted happened. For next 100 years of Czechoslovakia, we were visited by German and occupied, by Russian and occupied, and still we were every time able to come back as the independent state with its own independent characteristics. If you have all of that in mind, it should be more or less clear what the Czech strategy in any relation, including strategic partnership with the United States, should and must be based on. Theoretically, our biggest asset and enemy is our geopolitical position, which makes us, given our size, vulnerable to all the influences from the West and from the East. And the best solution which we are trying to find for the last 100 years is to have the military assurances of our national existence based on the national interest of the partner who would be outside of Europe. Because the best friend is the friend who is far away. The result is that probably the perfect summary of the Czech strategic thinking was done on different occasions by surprising source, Lord Hastings, the first Secretary General of NATO, who said that all what NATO is about is to keep Americans in, Russia out, and Germany down. End of quote. It was not the Czech quote. It's a British quote of the British first UN NATO secretary. And that basically summarizes everything what Central Europe was for centuries about. We had to solve how not to be the victim of the two biggest missionaries of Europe, France and Germany, and that was solved through the vehicle of the European Union. Because for the first time, we are all allies in one economic merger. And we had to solve our military security vis-à-vis especially the dangers from the east, Russia, and that was solved with our entry to NATO. If you look at it from the Czech perspective, then it's more or less clear why we are part of the European Union, why we are part of NATO, and why we feel both as a part of our strategic choice, which secures staying on the map as who we are and where we are. It's a little bit hard for me to take the other side. It should be taken by Americans, but for tango you need two. So Czech-American strategic partnership should be about both. But I can give you a glimpse how we think that you think. The basic problem of the Central Europe is that from the American point of view, we are not interesting. We are too small, too far away, insignificant for your national interest. So the only reason why you care is that further east is Russia, and Russia you do take seriously. So because of Russia, we are in the game. And we believe that this perception from the American side will dictate even for the future your interest about our part of the world. Obviously, we can speak about the shared values, about having the same type of civilization, about mutual support of the human rights. We can speak a lot of the things which politicians speak, but in the real politics of the Kissinger type, usually what applies is the egoistic national interest. We know that it's good for us, and we hope also for you, to be on your side because you look further east. Our usual problem is that sometimes it's hard to find American center European policy. If we look at the current stage of it, we can go back to the basic thing, which is President Trump's speech in Warsaw during her first visit of the area, where he, for many Europeans, the basic sentence was that it is the eastern part of Europe which is fighting for keeping Europe as the Europe in the upcoming culture battle. Little bit, we can say that President Trump was not too far from, surprisingly, ideas which we would hear in some countries of our region. And exactly it comes from the countries which are immediately punished for having this opinion later. It's not the case of the Czech Republic, so I will not comment on it. But again, it was a little bit puzzling what the Americans really expect and want from our part of the world. And we believe we together will be able to clarify it and find it. Why? Because it is crucial, I go back to geopolicy, from the geopolitical point of view for Czechs. It's good to be a Central European. It's much more dangerous to be Eastern European. And if we are Center or Eastern European, it's geopolitical decision which will be done not just by us. If you look at the map and you imagine Europe without Russian Federation, then we are at the eastern border of Europe, and we are an eastern nation. If you imagine Russia with European aspirations and European obligations and behavior of the Russians as the European nation, then we are in the center of Europe. So basically the question, if my country is Central European, Eastern European, Center Eastern, or where the hell we are, must be answered again in Kremlin. It's not our decision on which place of map we are, because it depends where Europe, with the standards of Europe, from political to economic ones, will really end. And we all know that that's the discussion where Americans, for their own national interest, will be involved in the future as well. So I will, for how long should I talk?
We'll come back, obviously, to
okay. Let me just end up with a classical ambassador summary, what the Czech Republic is about now. The Czech Republic now feels that we have a very strong NATO alliance where the United States still has, and we hope will have, the leading role. We believe that you are right if you ask us to pay more for our own defense, and we have to go there. We feel that we now have economically good times, which should be translated into the a little bit more thinking about who we are and where we go. To give you example, Czech Republic with 10 million people is now 0.26 of GDP of the world, which tells you almost nothing, but it has it's the 15th richest country of the European Union. We have the lowest unemployment rate in the European Union, 2.9, which means that basically the only real problem we have now is the shortage of labor. We avoided the migration crisis, having 4.3 foreigners, which is the European average, but at the same time, we are the 6th safest place on this planet. And if you look who is safer, it's the countries like Monaco, Iceland. And we have 4.7% GDP growth, which is really high given the standard of the European Union. Basically, Czechs are now having a happy time, which gives us the luxury to think more about the future. And we believe that in the future, we must keep the NATO obligations of all sides really strong, and we must be engaged much more into the discussion about what type of European Union we are building. Because these two things, security-wise and economy-wise, will influence our life the most in the next 10 years. So, Professor, you can see that we moved a lot since the time of the Cold War. So I will end up this part with a classical Czechoslovak joke from the Cold War. During the Cold War, Czechoslovakia was still Czechoslovak economy was still that good that we usually were categorized ahead of Austria till like 1968. So even from the Soviet perspective, we were something like the Switzerland of socialist camp. And based on that, we used to have a joke, what is the difference between former Czechoslovakia and Switzerland? Basically none. Both countries had freedom of speech. But in Switzerland, there was freedom even after the speech, which was not the case of previous socialist communist Czechoslovakia. So that's basically the basic thinking about who we are, West Slavic, fighting to stay who we are, not German, not Russian, where we are on the security sensitive place on the map, and what we want to do with it. Our reply is that all assurances which we need for keeping very steady and very sound growth of the absolutely democratic society, part of the Western culture as we've been for more than 1,000 years, is the development of EU into something what will have less problems than now, and keeping NATO as strong as we need it, given the new challenges.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Obviously, you provided a very coherent overview of the very complicated historical development of the Czech Republic. Particularly, it's a very sensitive geopolitical map, as you indicated correctly. And I think your last message about the spiritual, perhaps, framework, if you will, the value system of democracy is really critical. And in fact, the international community, at least those of us who try to learn the lessons, is we were really nourished for many decades with the literature and music and the wisdom that rose from the Czech Republic. Now, as a moderator, I'd like to ask a question, one or two, and we'll have Ambassador Ray also participate in our dialogue, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. Of course, one of the basic, I think, permanent picture of international life that nation states all are equal. Unfortunately, we know that some the countries are more equal than others. In the case of Europe, obviously, if we want to divide Europe into larger states or major states, those were stronger maybe on the bloc of Germany and then the UK and France, for example, and then the so-called quote-unquote lesser or smaller nations. And the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia obviously was a symbol of a captive nation. And on a personal level, if I may mention, back in 1961, I had the privilege of working at the UN for 1 year, which was one of the best lessons for me, aside from academic university work. And obviously at that time, with the principle of equality of nations, the Soviet Union had 3 votes. The Soviet Union and the Ukraine and the actually Belarus at that time, and then of course the East European countries, Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Bulgaria and the other Baltic states and so forth. So again, we had a disbalance actually at the United Nations. Now I think the good news that you also mentioned, the participation of the Czech Republic at the European Union through that framework and machinery, as well as NATO and the role of NATO. We were dealing with a different kind of a balance in terms of responsibilities and benefits and obligations. Here again, the difference is not only in terms of a general West, but the umbrella of NATO. And terrorism against one is terrorism against all. And in terms of the defense of the Czech Republic as we know it, as an equal member. And additionally, from what we know about the structure of NATO, different nations, they have different mandates to deal with specific challenges. If I may, I would like to ask one question particularly, since, again, as I mentioned, we work closely with NATO. For example, Turkey has an obligation to deal, and they have a center of excellence to combat terrorism in general. And we participate in their activities as well. Now, what we understand, of course, the Czech Republic has a responsibility in terms of center of excellence to deal with weapons of mass destruction, or the bio, the chem, the nuclear, whatever. This is a very unique and very major responsibility because in terms of the strategic challenges, so if you will, technical challenges. It's not only the primitive threat that somebody is driving a truck, through the crowd, as we have seen so vividly in New York just recently, or elsewhere in Sweden and Europe in general. But the most threatening challenge in terms of security is really the escalation to a super, if we may use this term, super terrorism, biological, chemical, radiological, and nuclear. Can you, again, address the role of the Czech Republic, why the Czech Republic has that kind of very unique and exceptional responsibility?
Mm-hmm. That's quite a specific question, but of course it all started with the Operation Desert Shield, where it was quite surprising for some of the armies that we have really the technical capacities that we developed over the years from the years of socialism. The nuclear capacity and the chemical warfare capacity then became our specialty inside the NATO world, and it's not the only one. We still have it. We have quite a number of the programs which continue with that one. But even from the very beginning, it was connected with with other specialties we had as the new allies of NATO. One of the specialty is obvious. Russia. They speak the Slavic language, we speak the Slavic language. We enjoyed their presence since 1968 on our territory. We know how they think and what they think. So if we speak politically incorrect, if you really want to know why Russia has the opinion on point X, you wouldn't go to the ambassador of Spain. A dear colleague of mine would not have the physical experience with every second Russian general, which unfortunately, given our history, we every time had. So the result of it is that Russia, as the strategic phenomenon, is part of our NATO specialty as much as our cooperation in the nuclear programs. I had here recently another visit of the Czech Nuclear Institute and scientists dealing directly with their American counterparts, and I must tell you, it was by numbers the biggest American delegation I have met during this year. Usually I have 5 Czechs, 5 Americans. This time it was like 20 Czechs and 60 Americans. Because there was a real interest on the both sides of the table what we could share in this particular area, because especially in some types of the specialized reactors, United States and the Czech Republic are the only 2 countries who have the practical experience with this specialized box inside the box categories of the nuclear research. Another thing which we provided as a specialized expertise for NATO and for our allies is Middle East. The former Czechoslovakia had really vast portfolio of relations in the Middle East. We theoretically recognized Palestine as the state already in 1988. As a former socialist Czechoslovakia. At the same time, we have more than 100,000 people of the Czech ancestry living in Israel, and we are the country which has probably the closest relation with Israel from all of the European Union when they got their share of problems. Result is that if you want to find a person who is small enough with no clear national interest and knows everybody in the Middle East, most probably he will be Czech. Americans already found it, and that's why we are proud now to represent as the protective power the United States in, surprise, Syria. You do not have currently relations with Syria. You closed your embassy in Damascus, which means you left there 3 buildings, close to 200 employees on your payroll, and it's the Czech Republic who takes care of them on everyday's business. And big part of my embassy is devoted actually to American-Syrian diplomatic and political relation, because that's something what we feel we can provide currently probably as the only of the American allies, because we stayed with our embassy in Damascus through all of these years, and sometimes we are the quite useful channel to talk to people you normally cannot talk much, and you have to. The same can be seen as let's say our probably new specialty, which will be North Korea. Everybody talks about the North Korea, but the only living son of the founder of the North Korea, Kim Il-sung, his only living son lives where? Obviously Prague, Czech Republic, because that's where he is a North Korean ambassador. Again, the Czechs can have very surprising small niches of some relations, be it technical expertise, as you mentioned, Professor, in the biological warfare, chemical warfare, and nuclear science, or given the political interest in the countries where sometimes is important who is talking. And if you talk to these states for last 50, 60 years, as we do, then you are talking for real, because you already had your share of 2 billion cups of tea, which you must finish before started talking.
So again, I think when one talks about the strategy, obviously there are different aspects of strategy, not only the military or the law enforcement and so on, but also the role of diplomacy. And with that, I'm going to invite our friend and colleague, to make some comments. You can use the mic, we'll get you the chair. You're welcome to join.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Alexander, Ambassador Kmonicek. A fascinating look at a country that I have long wanted to visit, but I retired from government service before I had an opportunity to. And I make it a practice. I only go to places that someone else buys the ticket for. What we've heard is, I think, a validation of what Professor Alexander and I have been working on for several months now, and that is the role of diplomacy as a tool in combating terrorism and violent extremism. Now, the ambassador gave an outstanding overview of the role diplomacy has played in the Czech Republic's economic security, its physical security, and in preserving its cultural identity. And I think that really, though, underscores or validates what we have been expressing here in a number of these programs, that diplomacy is a critical tool that should not be overlooked when we are thinking about how we combat, how we face violent extremism and terrorism. Unfortunately, our popular mass media, and even more unfortunately, many in senior levels in our government, have this view that diplomacy is not even a second-string player. Instead of being left on the bench, sometimes I think they want to leave us in the locker room, to excuse a sports metaphor. And while I wouldn't go so far as to even claim that diplomacy alone can do the job, I will, as a former career military person, as you heard Professor Alexander say, I never had a real job until 5 years ago when I retired from government service. I spent 50 years on the government dole. Neither can the military. I mean, the idea that you can combat something as complex and as diffuse as terrorism by one means alone is something that we need to get away from, and we need to get back into thinking, as so amply demonstrated here, our Czech friends, is that you have to have the whole package. You have to look at it in its totality and address it with a long view. And for that, sir, I thank you very much. And I think I can tell from the looks on your faces that you're running the questions through your mind, so I will do what any good speaker will do, and I will shut up and let you ask your questions.
Well, please join us. Obviously, we would like to develop a little dialogue. Mr. Ambassador, you spoke about the so-called mass destruction weapons that the Czech Republic has a special responsibility. We spoke about the role of diplomacy, and obviously the most successful diplomacy is diplomacy that you don't hear about in terms, as you mentioned, whether it is the Palestinian-Israeli role, and there are many issues that we are not mentioning. The same thing about Syria and obviously North Korea and so forth. Now, can I ask you another specific issue in terms of the challenge? Obviously, we know the challenge, and we see it again in discussions of NATO members, and we had two delegations from the EU right here who came to our center in Potomac to discuss the concern. And one of the concerns was the challenge, the Russian cyber, also the Chinese, but the Russian cyber challenge to Europe and meddling in the elections and espionage, etc., etc. Can you comment on that particular concern of the cyber challenge?
Mm-hmm. Definitely, it also a challenge for my country because we know that we, logical by geopolitics dictated, must be part of the Russian interest, both for their cyber people, both for their trolls and for the espionage. We know that we are the classical spy target for Russia and China. It's nothing new for us, and we know how to face it. As for the cybersecurity, we were one of the first who started the Center for the Cybersecurity. We are relatively robust on it, given it substantial resources. We have a specialized institution under the national security apparatus of the Czech Republic, which monitors it, and we because we know that it's sometimes hard to distinguish what is the, let's say, the intelligence threat and what is the propaganda. We covered that part with a special unit inside the Ministry of Interior, which basically tries to find and actively work against the propaganda in the cyberspace, including the fake news, hoax. Simply, if they can see that something is spreading virally in the cyberspace, which potentially has any inclination to touch something what would be in the strategic disinterest of the Czech Republic, that they immediately go online with the real story, or simply announcing that this part of the news was created by this person for that person. So the basic fight for security in cyberspace is the basic tool is the truth. If you can confront the hoax of the fake news with the truth, you kill the virus the moment it is created. And you must be able to do it with the sources, so everyone inquisitive enough can go back to your sources and can see that the truth will prevail over all the trolling and bending the reality for the propaganda purposes. That's for sure. On the other hand, we can use the Russian propaganda creatively. If they see our weak point, they will attack it. So they help us to find our weak points.
Right. Well, you obviously put your finger on the most important element, the truth versus fake news and all that. But as I remember, the UN Krishna Menon, who was the the representative and I think foreign minister also of India, spoke about the truth, and he said the truth is one, but people call it by different names. So it's a question of I would say interpretation, and that's the so-called insidious kind of challenge, the quiet explosive that we have to deal with, and this is the battle, the long-range battle to discuss whether it is a battle of civilization or value system or whatever it is. That's the most difficult, obviously. But again, to go back to the question of value system and the proven, I think, evidence about Czechoslovakia at the time trying to survive all the pressures, and now the Czech Republic and so forth. But, lately again, we see in the press some concern, even some articles, whether it's Washington Post or New York Times or whatever, about the internal or domestic, I think, expressions that we find in terms of party politics in the Czech Republic. Some are saying perhaps the Czech Republic is moving in the maybe direction of some expressions in Poland, or perhaps even some ideas that President Trump has in mind. Can you clarify this kind of confusion?
Let me just skip back to the previous one, and then I will follow with this one. Well, what we need to know is to have a correct name of the things. You cannot fight the thing which you cannot name. And in cyberspace, we must be sure to address what is moving there by the correct name. And we must be able to distinguish between hoaxes, which is not the truth. It's something what you can kill with the truth. Somebody claims that yesterday was an attack in Pennsylvania Station.
Right.
Well, you can prove it's not. Okay, that you can fight.
Or conspiracy theories?
Yeah, conspiracy. Okay, that's a different
another
thing.
one.
That's another one, because hoax you can fight with the truth. You must be able to distinguish between facts, hoax, and propaganda.
Right.
Propaganda needn't be the lie. Propaganda is banded truth. And you are absolutely correct that it can be very individual. You will bend it like that, I will bend it the opposite way. It's still the same fact from 2 points of view, and the fight between these two is called surprise democracy. So it's absolutely okay, this bending. And it's it's almost impossible to fight propaganda with the truth. You can fight propaganda with a different propaganda, with the opposite bending.
Information.
Yeah. Well, information.
yeah.
Okay, fact is the information.
Right.
The selection of information already makes propaganda.
Right, that's true.
Yeah? So we must be able to identify what we can fight in cyberspace and what we cannot. Facts can defeat the hoax. Facts cannot defeat propaganda. For propaganda, you will have to have a counter propaganda, and then it's the fight for the human soul.
Right.
But it's a different art than to fighting hoaxes with facts. And that's what is constantly mixed when people talk about it. Back to your later question. Yes, it's true that we had the elections, and the result of the elections is that for the first time we have in parliament even the political movements which are not classical political parties, but the movements which might be called with a nationalistic element in it. Comically Czech enough, if you look for the real Czech nationalist under the slogan "Czech for Czechs only," the leader of that party is quarter Japanese, quarter Korean, half Moravian. So it's very much like a good soldier Schweik story. But without joking, it is a parliamentary party who represents their voters. They got 22 members of parliament in 200 seats strong parliament. And they definitely will try to influence the Czech policy for the future. We do not believe currently that they will have a bigger, significant, or shaping role on the Czech domestic policy, and we do not expect absolutely any change in the foreign policy. Why we conclude that? Because we have one party which would like to get us out of NATO. It's a Communist Party.
Right.
And the Communist Party has 15 members in 200 members strong parliament. They have never been in any governmental coalition since 1989. And the number of their voters went to 50% in recent elections what they had 4 years ago. So it's basically the party which significance goes lower and lower in time. Part of their electorate logically doesn't disappear, but goes to the parties which would probably have a little bit nationalistic element inside of it. But even with their 22 members of parliament, we currently do not see any attempt to get them into the governmental coalition. Quite the opposite. Most probably the new prime minister, the winner of election, Mr. Andrej Babiš, would have very easy time if he took this nationalistic party and the Communist Party plus somebody else into his coalition, and he would have a majority. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he goes through the valley of pain and tears to talk to the normal, let's say, standard political parties to create a governmental coalition which would make sure his own priorities, which is NATO, EU, more logical EU, if I put it into three parts.
Thank you for clarification. Do you have a question or comment now, or?
Well, I was just when the ambassador was talking about the difficulties in getting inside the American mind in terms of how the U.S. views the U.S.
We can see the mixed signals. You
Is this-
obviously have the problem with Poland, and if you send president to visit one country of the region, it's Poland.
Well,
Poland first. Yeah.
what I was wondering is how much understanding is there among the people who have to manage this relationship of the difficulty this country has in managing relationships where we have to consider the desires of a large number of countries in a region when we in fact don't do multilateral diplomacy very well. And so how does a country like the Czech Republic deal with a country that wants to deal with each of its neighbors one-on-one and is unable to come back and put all of those things together into a coherent policy that takes the region into consideration?
Well, how we deal with it, we understand our own size, and that's why we try to show to our American friends that there are at least some specialties where we cannot be replaced by anybody else. That's probably the only thing which simply we need to be friends, not just because we are the same civilization, that we share the same values and it's very easy to be friends. There must be the practical content of it which will bring our Czech topic as a recognizable American topic. And it's the same problem for every smaller nation in the world to find topic which will be ours, yours, and playable in your domestic policy. Because only such a topic is actually valid. So it's a constant strive from our side to find, to use the sport terminology, enough of the balls, and once in 5 years to make a home run. And then we know we have the attention which we need. But I agree. I can see that American tendency, which I would understand, which is like to take area as one, not to talk to every single state of the size of the bigger American city. On the other hand, a big reluctance to the Visegrad concept, which is exactly what we try to do, to speak as the area. I can see that the American foreign policy really prefers the bilateral relations, one by one, to find later that you don't have time for it.
Yep, it's much more complicated. Okay, we'll ask our distinguished audience to jump into our discussion dialogue. Any comment or question?
Nobody. It's all
Well,
for you.
Well,
You overwhelmed them.
it's it reminds me. You spoke. You provided a joke during the Cold War. What comes to mind is another joke during the Cold War when Sasha went to school that morning, and the teacher asked him, "Tell me, who is your father?" He said, "Stalin." "Who is your mother?" "Russia." "What would you like to be when you grow up?" He said, "An orphan." So, but here, we are in a free society, and we can speak up. Let me ask you another very important question. I think your point, obviously, is so valid, is so correct in terms of some of the principles of international affairs. One of them is reciprocity, and what the Czech can offer. As I said, in general, we were nourished by culture for so many years. Anyone who comes to Prague, they realize, whether they go to the Kafka Museum or anything else, the rich, I think, culture of the Czech people and so on. But let me move on and ask a practical question. One of the tragic challenges, aside from the when we say strategic everything, is basically within the framework of strategy, of the so-called struggle for power within, among nations, whatever. But one of the major challenges that has another dimension and characteristic is the humanitarian issue. And here again, tragically, we cannot avoid to look at the refugee crisis around the world, whether it is some of the developments in Africa or Asia that we don't see very much on the news, but we also see the movement of refugees and asylum seekers and so on moving towards Europe. The old saying is that people vote by, if they can, by their feet, but here the people have to swim the ocean and finally reach Europe, whether from Asia or Africa or elsewhere. Now, just for clarification, what is actually, because there is a great deal of confusion about the policies of specific countries, the policies of the EU, in terms of how to deal with the refugee issue from a Czech Republic point of view.
Mhm. Okay. Close to 1 million refugees came to Europe through probably the biggest migration crisis after the end of the Second World War in recent 2 years. As for the Czech Republic, our composition, as I said, is that currently we have 4.3% of our citizens born abroad, and we have 14 recognized national minorities. By the way, refugees already influence this situation. Because if I look at the media, there will be nothing in connection of migration and the Czechs, or there will be that the Czechs do not want migrants because they have none. None of this is true. We do have migrants, and we do have first of all, the migrants from the east, which are technically not called migrants. So if the European Union, which means us, says we are under the huge migration wave from the south, actually there's the second migration wave from the east. After 70 years of Czechoslovakia and the separation, you would expect that the biggest national minority of my country will be Slovaks. Logically, Slovakia. That's what we thought. Not true anymore. Our biggest national minority today is Ukrainians. Because Ukrainians started going to the west, meaning to us, and they stopped going back. Because we traditionally had a smaller Ukrainian community commuting there and back for better life and labor opportunities. They stopped going back to Ukraine. Basically, the moment there was a danger, they would be drafted to Ukrainian army. The result is that currently we have at least legally 140,000 Ukrainians as the strongest migration community, which is not part of the so-called refugee crisis. So imagine the country who gets 140,000 Ukrainians and then goes to Brussels to have a discussion if you are ready to receive 2,000 Syrians. Gives you the number. We were very unhappy, and that's why we went again against it when the European Union tried to push through the system of the compulsory quotas. What did it mean? It meant that in Brussels there will be assigned quota of the people who will be sent to your country, irrespective of the local asylum experience. Meaning, if we are prepared for these communities or if we are specialized at different communities. And that's exactly what was our problem. Also, the problem was the technical delivery of that program. The program basically meant that you take a person from the hotspot in Italy or Greece, you relocate the person to the Czech Republic, and that's it. But it's not that it, because the next day this person goes to see his cousin in Germany. And you have no means how to stop him at the border because we are part of the Schengen visa-free area. So it is basically like if you had a huge immigration camp, let's say somewhere in New Mexico, where you arbitrarily would say the person, you will live in Philadelphia, and all your relatives are in New York. How would I keep you in Philadelphia? Chained? Or I would introduce the border between Philadelphia and New York? That was exactly what the plan was about. And we said, sorry, it's not about the solidarity, it's about being logical. We want to keep Europe as an open visa-free space, which means that you cannot physically force a person to live in the place where he or she doesn't want to live. Then it makes no sense to make a quota, which basically means you will be forced to live there, where you have no mean how to secure it. That's the part which is usually missing from the media, and that was exactly the reason why the Czech Republic voted against. Well, we voted against, and because we are Democrats, we had to accept that the majority voted for. And so we got our quota of roughly 1,200 people, which we should relocate to the Czech Republic. Because you have no technical ability how to keep them there against their own will, you must base it on their will. And we are still waiting for the people who want to be relocated to the Czech Republic. Because the last time we got like 10 applicants from Italy, 6 of them disappeared overnight once they were given the happy news they will be new Czechs. They don't want to be new Czechs, they want to be new German, because there is much better subsidized policy. And that's where their communities are, that's where their families are. So it shows you a much more complicated process inside the European Union, where we feel that the European Union should go in the way that first, if we are a state as the European Union, we must be able to protect our own borders, or it's the theoretical entity. And B, we should be allowed to have our own national migration laws, because that will allow each of us members to share the solidarity and focus it on the specialized communities which we know we can assimilate very easily. And let's face it, people see it for themselves. If you are a Somali, you don't go to Prague, you go to Somali's community in Sweden or in Germany. If you are Tunisian, you go to around Dresden, where they all are. If you are Ukrainian, you go to Prague, because that's where all your cousins are. So basically reality already dictates what politicians try to create in some chart which physically, technically doesn't work. So we are for the solidarity, we do take refugees, we do have refugees, and we have the refugees who are so good assimilated that we even mentally do not consider them refugees.
Thank you for providing some clarity to the confusion related to this issue. One, we appreciate very much your generosity in terms of time. I have one last question to ask, and in terms of learning the lesson, we had one of the seminars recently. We dealt with the issue of separatist movements
Mhm.
and the principle of self-determination. In fact, we have here a colleague from Spain, and we have the ambassador of Spain who will share with us some of their views in terms of Catalonia and the Basque issue. In terms of the Czech, I think experience, people are a little bit confused about the development, the political development from Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Mhm.
And in fact, I remember, some 20 years ago, we had a conference at Tel Aviv University related to separatism and the principle also of self-determination. And we had a long list of separatist movements, from Spain at that time, the Basque group particularly, and many other nations in Europe and around the world, and so on. And we didn't deal with Czechoslovakia because at that time we thought it's a different, really phenomenon, example, not of separatism from your own country, but an agreement to establish two states. So in other words, what's the lesson, again, in terms of the Czech and Slovak experience?
Well, as you know, after the Velvet Revolution, 1989, we had something what we call Velvet Divorce, 1993. It was very quick, not that quick as media claim. They usually say it took us 3 months to separate two countries. Not at all. It took us like 10 years to really clean the table, because Czechoslovakia was the artificial creation. After the First World War, we had Czechoslovakia, where was 5 million Czechs, 3 million German, and 2 million Slovaks. So again, to keep the Slavic part of Czechoslovakia bigger than the German part of Czechoslovakia, the decision was basically to create a new artificial entity, Czechoslovakia. They were 3 states created in Versailles like that. Czechoslovakia, not anymore around, Yugoslavia,
Right.
not anymore around, and Kurdistan.
Right.
Very, very specific issue up to today. We also thought that it's experiment which worked, and there is no need to go separate. Truth is that if there are some lessons out of it, that the artificiality never survives for weight or for eternity. What is artificial? Artificially came together, will artificially come apart. Czechs and Slovaks never in 1,000 years of history had the same state. We were all the time in the German orbit, Slovaks were all the time in the Hungarian orbit. We solved it in the way joining it together, but it was sort of artificial. We thought working artificial experience. The second lesson is that if you start dividing the countries, you better sure to divide it into the 2 parts which are economically viable, which luckily we had. The success of Slovakia proved that they are economically viable, independent country. The third lesson which is there is it will never take as short time as you dream of. We really thought that if we divide it, and it's clear where the border is more or less, it's clear who is Czech, it's clear who is Slovak, we will divide it in 3 months. Well, it took us almost 10 years. Because everything, including army, police, treasury, banks, flag, anthem, military, diplomatic offices, buildings around the world, had to be divided because it was clear what is Czech, it was clear what is Slovak, but it was unclear how to divide what is federal, meaning Czechoslovak. And it had to go one way or the other. Imagine if you had the separation of Texas from the United States, and you would have to go all around the place and separate American campuses into what is Texas and what is United States.
There is a movement, you know.
I know that's why I used the,
But,
the Texas example. So no surprise it took us 10 years. And the fourth lesson would be that if it is done fair and in a good faith with the other party, as it was between Czechs and Slovaks, it can be done and no harm is done. Now we are both in the European Union. We really, even mentally, I must say, we don't take each other as classical foreigners. If you ask the Czech diaspora around the world, they usually still claim they are Czechoslovaks. It's really hard for us to take each other as a 100% foreigners. Also, given the proximity of our languages, given 70 years of the common history, and given the number of the mixed families. Because imagine, if your father is Czech and your mother is Slovak, are you Czech or Slovak or Czechoslovak? But you cannot be Czechoslovak, you must decide. 2 days ago, I had here former President Václav Klaus, who was actually the person who was in charge of the division on the Czech and Slovak side, and he said the typical paradox of my life was that I had to dissolve Czechoslovakia, and I stayed with my Slovak wife.
Right.
So even for him, it was a mixed family.
Right.
And his children had to opt if they will be Slovaks after the mother or Czechs after the father. To make things complicated, my dear colleague, Czech ambassador to Slovakia, is former First Lady who is Slovak, now Czech ambassador to Slovakia. So no surprise that when I came much younger as a Czech ambassador to the United Nations, many colleagues joked with me that we separated only to have 2 votes.
Right.
And it took me some time to organize a fight, Czech-Slovak fight, where we had the candidate for the same commission. And only then my colleagues understood that we are really fighting with my Slovak colleague who will win the chairmanship of that committee. And only with that we persuaded them that we are 2 absolutely separate nations with their own national priorities. So they are lessons,
Yeah.
but the good ones.
Yeah. In fact, as an outsider, to me, maybe the most significant lesson that there was no need to have a civil war in order to fight out, as we know, even the American experience, it's a interesting one. Anyway, anything?
I am absolutely in awe.
Okay, you said that.
You're absolutely full of Czechs.
Diplomatic answer. Last call. Any question? If not, we're going to end up at least that phase of the dialogue and looking forward to continue the relationships. And in fact, we had one intern who was here, a graduate, and he also was at law school in Oregon, right? That he fell in love with a Czech woman, and he left us, and he went to Prague, and we had to recommend him for a job.
Mhm.
So that's I think, very interesting human dimension of that. So again, we look forward to continue the dialogue with you and your mission in the embassy and also the cultural level as well. And we wish you obviously all the best. As we say, whatever is best in your definition for the Czech Republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And first of all, let me thank to all the audience who spent time with the Czech Republic. I hope it was not the usual boring speech of ambassador full of successes and the presentation of graphs. You can find this anywhere on internet. We do value that you spent your free time with the Czech Republic. And if you haven't been to my country, please come, because you can check for yourself. It is the 6th safest place on the world, with the 12 million visitors to 10 million country every year. So don't be afraid you will not be able to speak English. Nobody speaks Czech there. Everybody you will meet is actually the visiting foreigner.
Right. Thank you very much. We're not going to award you a military medal, since you're not only a diplomat but a true scholar. So with that, we would like to present to you a couple of things. One book that my colleague Mike Swetnam, who is the CEO of the Potomac and is involved in this work for a long time, myself, on the Al-Qaeda. You can read all the emails. You know, they're not classified anymore. Secondly,
and we are glad it was not our secret contact. There are no emails with Czechs.
Yeah, right. No cyber. Well, you know, of course, the military mission, rescue mission that was on the operation in Pakistan to kill bin Laden, you know, they were able to get all the materials and they were released. So we tried to organize it according to topics to make some sense out of it, not only in terms of the strategic issues, but also personal communication with his family and all that.
I can see.
Secondly, our colleague here, General Al Gray, was the commandant of the Marine. Unfortunately, is involved because of the Veterans Day with the families of those who were killed in the service. So something of his saying. And since we deal with NATO, we participated, obviously, to publish that journal, or quarterly, or whatever, with NATO through Turkey base. And finally, on the bio defense, one of the projects that Potomac Institute and our center and the Hudson joined together. So this is one of the reports.
Thank you.
And we have other reports that perhaps your colleagues can carry it.
And we have something to read.
We appreciate very, very much for your contribution. And it is the beginning of dialogue, not the end of it. Thank you very, very much.
And thanks to all of you.